Hush harbor.
Digital hush harbor.
Yeah, it's like a little digital hush harbor thing we got going on here. Especially, sometimes people forget that we actually stream live.
So it is
People meaning you.
No,
like,
no, 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 no. I usually remember, but some other folks. But
yeah.
so, greetings, everyone. I know we're waiting for people to come, but just if you see the rerun or the replay of this, then I want to just say hi because I know that we have developed a nice little crowd of folks that come and listen to us, and so thank you, thank you, thank you for just listening and connecting with us every month. We have been doing this for 2 years and have been talking and tossing
Has it been two
around.
years?
It has been 2 years.
Wow.
It's actually almost three. It's like 2.5 because we started with Lovecraft Country,
Okay.
2020.
Okay.
That's when we
Okay.
started. Yeah, it's
That's a
been a
good way
minute.
to start.
And it was an excellent way to start. And we need a name. And so if you're listening to this, then do us a favor and put in the chat a name so we can think about names. We've tossed around a couple of names between us and we're trying to come up with the consensus on names, but we need a name. But I want to start out just kind of by introducing the topic for today and then introducing my sister friends, sister colleagues that are with me today to discuss. We're going to discuss the documentary, The Sun Rises in the East. And really, this is part of a series that we're going to do for the summer where we're going to talk about Black genius in the different ways that Black genius shows up. And so, our first way of doing that this month is to discuss this documentary. So, if you haven't seen it, you can get it on Amazon. You have to rent it on Amazon. It's just a couple of bucks. And so, I definitely think that is well worth the watch. And I think it is excellent that the two sisters that are on with me right now are the ones that are here right now to discuss this because of the significance, I think, of the work that was being done and the fact that I didn't know anything about this work. I knew about the book once I was in college, but I didn't know about it before. And so I want to jump into the discussion. First, I want to introduce my sister colleague that's all the way out there in Los Angeles, California, who's in the Tongva territory. That is Thandisizwe Chimurenga. She is an author coming out with multiple books. She's already authored books, and she said she's coming out with some more, so she's going to tell us about that. She's a journalist and a social commentator. So, hey, what's up, Sister Thandi? Got a nice little
Hey.
background going on. And then also my sister friend, we've been doing this now 25 years in this beautiful struggle. Dr. Kenja McCray, who is a historian, and she is a professor over at Clayton State University here in Muskogee Territory, Atlanta, Georgia. And again, I'm Dr. Ifetayo Ojelade. I'm a psychologist and just out here trying to make it do what it do.
You're a healer. You're a healer.
Trying to make it help our folks heal in all kinds of revolutionary and different ways. And hopefully this will be one of them. So I want to jump into this documentary, The Sun Rises in the East. And I'm looking at it over here because I had it up. And I think it was really powerful. One of the things that I want to do to kind of set the context, and Dr. McCray, I want you to jump in first with this, is because I know your dissertation work was really around Kawaida and the concepts and looking at the women of Kawaida. And many times I think people haven't heard that concept. I know I had a whole PhD and had not heard of the concept until you told me about it. And so I'm wondering if you can define just Kawaida, that concept first, because since that was kind of foundational to what they were doing in the East.
Yeah, so Kawaida, I didn't know about it either. Until I took class with Dr. Akinyele Umoja at Georgia State University. And how I got interested in it, I know you didn't ask this, but just so the audience knows how I got interested, I was in a PhD program in history at Georgia State and was looking for a dissertation topic. And I knew I was interested in women in the Black freedom struggle in the 20th century. Had read a lot about the civil rights movement. A lot of my mentors from my undergrad and master's training, like Vicky Crawford, um, and the late Jacqueline Rouse, studied Black women in the civil rights movement. And I thought those two scholars wrote a real trailblazing book um, about women torch bearers and trailblazers in the civil rights movement. And I thought, wow, there should be something like this about the Black Power movement, especially since we, at the time, which was, I started in the early 2000s, we had the autobiographies coming out and biographies, right? And I don't know what you all's experiences were, but mine, you had to read Asada, and it was passed to you. It was passed to you hand to hand. It probably wasn't initially assigned to you, right?
When
You
I was
had to read.
20.
That's a
Yeah,
good rite of passage.
Yes,
yeah.
right. Huh? What'd you say now?
I said that's a good rite of passage.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. And I don't know about A Taste of Power. You had to read
Yeah.
Elaine Brown's A Taste of Power, right?
Yeah.
So there was this Angela Davis's autobiography. And so we knew about some of the experiences of women in the Black Power movement through these autobiographies and biographical sketches, but I didn't have a take that was sort of a survey of their experiences and an encapsulation. So I was talking to Dr. Umoja about this, and I said, but there so much is coming out on the Black Panther Party right now. So that's really happening around the Black Panther Party. And then he said, why don't you do women in Kawaida? And I was like, huh? I usually tell the story. I said, what? At first I didn't even know what he was saying. Right. I have been a faithful celebrant of Kwanzaa since I got to Spelman College in the early 90s. But I went to arrived in Atlanta to attend Spelman College in the 1990s, but I did not know what Kawaida was, which was the larger philosophy that produced Kwanzaa. And there were several in the 1960s, about 1960, mid 1960s to the mid 1970s, were the heyday of Kawaida philosophy and its institutional expressions. And it had a whole slate of holidays. And depending on your organization, you had some different holidays, right? And it was basically a Kiswahili term, and Kiswahili, for those who may be unfamiliar, is a language spoken in Eastern and Central Africa. And so it is a Kiswahili term meaning tradition and reason, but it was utilized by Maulana Karenga and other members of the US organization, and developed, right, originally to mean tradition and reason. And it was it was conceived, right, to be an everyday philosophy for everyday living, to guide everyday living and to undergird the liberation struggles of the 1960s and 70s. So that was Kawaida, and that gives people an idea of where I was coming from when I was looking at the sunrises in the east. Do you want me to say more about women?
No, 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 no.
Okay,
I was going to be, so if this was, because I never heard it couched that way. So one, I thought, where does the thing about like work, like doing the work, where does that concept come from, or where does that fit into Kawaida?
okay. So there another expression of Kawaida are the 7 principles. I knew them as the 7 principles of Kwanzaa, right? Umoja, Kujichagulia, Kumba, right? Okay, Nia Imani. So they were initially called the 7 principles of Blackness, to give you an idea of how they were initially conceived, and I guess I don't want to say deployed, but applied to everyday life. And so when I was reading literature from Kawaida organizations or Kawaida influenced organizations, right, you might have later disavowed Kawaida or Dr. Karenga, but at a time there was a Kawaida moment when there were plenty of organizations that were guided by this philosophy. So when I was reading the literature from groups like Ahidiana in New Orleans, the East, right, in Brooklyn, uh, in particular in Brooklyn, in Philly, right, Congress of African People, Newark, New Jersey, a lot of times people say, okay, well, people talk about, say, Kuji Chagulia, Ujamaa, right? People talk about Kuumba, Imani, but even though we have a philosophy of collective work and responsibility, that doesn't get to the heart of the matter. Because a lot of people still show up talking about they're going to do the collective work and do a lot of talking. But what we need to nation build effectively, to institution build at this time, is long, protracted work, right?
Got it.
Daily, weekly, and that they called kazi. And so a lot of,
Okay.
yes, and so a
Okay.
lot of there was a distinction, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so between like an ujima and a kazi. So what they would say in a lot of the groups is kazi, that's the blackest of all the, the principles. Okay, show up and do the work, get the work done, show and
Got
prove, put in the work, as Sister Thandi says, right? So so that's what I put in the name of my dissertation, I called them From Compliments to Kazi Leaders, the study From Compliments with Ease, Complements, and we can get into why that, to Kazi leaders, because in particular the East Sisterhood, I think to this day when they get together and do planning for the International African Arts Festival in Brooklyn, um, which came out of the East, right? And they masterminded that, and they implemented it. And a lot of times their literature would say kazi, kazi, kazi. Kazi is the blackest of them all. Like they would start with kazi. And so I that's where that long protracted work perception comes from.
Okay, and Nozibele, I want to pull you in a second. I want to go to Sister Thandi, but I do have one more question for Njimile. So Nozibele joins us. She's an anthropology professor and also the owner of Grand Tressa Hair Products. Before Sister Thandi, I want you to comment, and really from the perspective of growing up in Los Angeles like myself, and whether or not you heard these concepts of Kawaida and Kazi and all of that stuff. So I want you to comment from your perspective from being on the West Coast. But before that, I'm curious because you said in Jamila, you said that the principles like the Nguzu Saba were like kind of the principles of how for the US organization, other Kawaida based organizations, how they should live their lives. Then why was Ron Karenga around there kidnapping and harming Black women?
Oh like, Lord, not the toaster again. I can't eat Pop-Tarts in peace anymore.
I'm wondering. So if this is supposed to be part of the principle,
this is a leading question, ma'am.
You know what though? Like, but seriously though, we need to have that discussion around cultural nationalism and all of this stuff that this discussion on the East is bringing up.
Mm-hmm.
We should do an actual show on that. I'm not sure what the toaster is, but yeah, we should do a show on that. But I don't know what that has to do with the film. I'm just gonna say that and shut up.
No, it doesn't. But I was just wondering what she said that. So I'm just wondering because if it's supposed to be the foundation of everything, then what's up with the harming Black women?
You should fully disclose your positionality. So, and then I definitely think that part of the conversation should be had, but this is about the East organization, right?
Okay, fine.
And
fine. I still want to know.
Yeah.
Don't be
proud. But later. Yeah, let's not start with that.
No, okay.
No, I'll say this. Kawaida philosophy, particularly initially, although it changed over time, took the position that men and women were not equal, that gender equality was the devil's concept, and that Kawaida held that the males and females should be complementary, and that's that COMPLEM. All right. And so that meant women had their places and men had their places and roles. So this is in, I'd say, contrast to more recent, right, perceptions of gender as a spectrum. So therein lies some of the conflict and the struggle, because here you have a movement that's about equality, recognizing that people of the African world's full humanity, but then it has this caveat about gender. And I must say, the women in Kawaida influenced organizations did not remain silent on that. And then, like I said, in terms of how you come out the box with the question about the principles and then the treatment of women, and in particular, the incidents around abuse of women in the US organization, I do think that we should first introduce like the positionalities around that, because Scott Brown wrote a book on the US organization and some articles as well. And in some of the articles, he talks about how a lot of conversations around cultural nationalism and Kawaida get dichotomized, right? And get formed and formulated around this idea about the US organization and the Black Panther Party and their conflicts. And then Kawaida and the US organization all get sort of, the baby gets thrown out with the bathwater, around Karenga's abuse of or ordering the torture of women within the US organization. And people usually take one side or the other with that situation, but I think we should have a more measured conversation about it. And Thandi can lead that because that's also a part of her research.
So Thandi, hey, Sister Estee, Thandi, jump in here in this conversation.
Nope. What was the original thing you asked?
No, I'm wondering, just in terms of going back to the principles of Kawaida. So if we look at the principles in and of itself, in the East was not part of the US organizations, two totally different organizations, right, but happened to use these principles. When you were growing up in Los Angeles, did you hear anything about Kawaida or these principles? I know I never heard of any of this
Nothing at all. And the discussion we were having off camera before we went live, and Jamila and I, we were chopping it up, and I was just saying, I appreciate this video. It is a wonderful documentation of this phenomenon known as the East. It's also part of the larger documentation that needs to be created around Pan-African cultural nationalism, revolutionary nationalism in the U.S., East Coast, and in the U.S. But what I was saying was that I grew up out here, born and raised in LA, went to high school, went to junior college with some friends. I was aimless. I didn't know what I was going to do. I grew up because my older brother went to UCLA. I figured, okay, I'm going to go to UCLA. My sister pledged Delta Sigma Theta. Okay, I'm going to pledge Delta Sigma Theta at UCLA, right? This is the mild of a child. But the friends I was hanging out with, they were like, we're going to Howard University. And they were clear on it, and they were set on it. I was like, okay, well, I'm following y'all. And because I had a 4.0 GPA and knew it was going to drop, I applied to Howard with the 4.0. and I was accepted. Thank God they didn't rescind the acceptance. Go off to Washington, D.C., and it was a wonderful experience that I still cherish in my heart. I got a mad love for D.C., not just Howard, but Washington, D.C., as I was telling in Jamile. You got New York City with the United Nations, international cosmopolitan city. You got Washington, D.C., which is the seat of government. So you've got in New York, you got African leaders, Caribbean leaders, resistance leaders, heads of state who are black, which we may not have ever seen before, coming into the city to deal with the United Nations. In Washington, D.C., you've got these consulates and embassies representing all of these countries coming in to the city and interacting with Howard University. Then you've got Atlanta, Georgia, which to a smaller extent, but also has people coming into the city because of Morehouse and Spelman and their history. So I'm out here in Washington, D.C., which is one of the most vibrant, rich, cultural black communities I have ever seen, black institutions. And when Kwanzaa comes around, I call it Kwanzaa hopping. It's going to be 3-4 events every night of Kwanzaa, like for 7 days. You go to a program on the night of Umoja, and then you relieve that and go to another side of the city, and there's another Umoja program. The same thing on Kuji Chagalia the second night. You can hit different places throughout the city where everyone is like involved in this. And growing up here in Los Angeles, like I said, we got New York, which is international cosmopolitan, Washington, D.C., international cosmopolitan, Atlanta on a smaller scale, international cosmopolitan. You come out here to Los Angeles, and not only is it a geographic, physical desert, it's also a cultural desert. At the time, the only, and I got to be careful how I say this, I don't know if it was the only, but the most prominent organization or presence that was holding up the cultural banner was that of the US organization. And after a series, after the series of confrontations, Bunchy and John on the campus of UCLA, two Panthers in San Diego, and culminating with the kidnapping and torture of Gail Davis and Deborah Jones in 1970, cultural nationalism has left a bad taste in people's mouths. Mm-hmm. So I'm off to Howard. I come back, hey, where the Kwanzaa at? And people looking at me like,
I know my daddy would be looking at you sideways.
You haven't said anything about your dad, though. I was out there talking about us Panther conflict, and you have not said. You just came out of the box like, so your positionality is your father was a Panther and had a very strong perspective about cultural nationalism and Chimurenga. So, and again, we're not talking about the US organization. We're talking about a Brooklyn-based institution that developed out of a lot of philosophies, including Kawaida philosophy. So there's that. But I'm sorry to interrupt you.
No problem. The other thing I wanted to say, which my memory is not serving me as correctly as it should, I'm gonna need to go back. In addition to all that was happening in Southern California, there was the incident in Northern California between the Black Panther Party in its early phases and another group that called itself the Black Panther Party, but had been initiated by, had membership of people who were a part of the Revolutionary Action Movement and the Afro-American Association, which was led by a man by the name of Donald Warden. And the way the story gets told is this group of Panthers, or Betty Shabazz, the widow of Malcolm X, was coming to town and needed to be protected. And the Huey Bobby faction of the Panther Party was like, we got you, sis, and had their guns because guns could be openly displayed and carried at that time. Whereas this other Panther formation had guns with no bullets in them. They were just for show, or what people call paper Panthers. And so there's always been that undercurrent of, and like I said, that was in the beginnings. As we go throughout later on, you have the interactions in Southern California between us and the Panthers, leading to the deaths of Bunchy and John, which was COINTELPRO orchestrated. We have to state that. And the torture of Deborah and Gail, which some in us feel was COINTELPRO orchestrated also. But the point being is that this has colored the perception of cultural nationalism out here on the West Coast, which is why David Hilliard, as in this particular book that I was talking to Nozibele about, the An American Family, the Shakurs and the Nation They Created, you have people saying David Hilliard comes out to New York and is almost, David Hilliard, the chief of staff of the Black Panther Party, he is almost aghast at the New York chapter, Harlem, Bronx chapters of the Panther Party, because the leadership is people wearing dashikis and galas and got African names. And it's like, oh my God. It's almost like.
But I do think that, and I think that that's important.
The reason for that, though, is because, like I said, that history of being in interaction with Africans from the Caribbean, from Africa, from the United Kingdom, from Britain, these revolutionaries, students, refugees from liberation movements, they had a different perspective.
And I do think it's important for us to kind of put those two things together, because, I mean, we got half of us that are from the eastern side of the United States, and then two of us that are from the western side of the United States, because that does have an influence. And for full disclosure, yes, my parents were very involved. My parents were at UCLA. And so, yes, I absolutely grew up with no connection with cultural nationalism. I remember even saying something about an African name or African clothes, and my dad, who definitely had a political consciousness, was like, that's that cultural nationalism stuff. And so there was an absolute hostility towards anything that had to do with that. And now I understand is because they were traumatized by what their experience was. And so I think those things play a role in who got exposed to what. But I want to go back and shift our conversation back to the Sunrises in the East, and specifically the documentary, because I do think it's important. Like, as I was looking at this documentary, I was like, this information is important to know that this happened here. And I want to pull in you, Nozibele, and then also you, Estee, to kind of get your perspectives of just what you experienced in looking at the documentary.
Yeah. I just wanted to say real briefly that it's really surprising to me that all the wonderful things that came out of the US organization, that it wasn't more of a cultural presence in LA and California. And maybe we can talk later about the conflict between us and the Panthers in terms of how that might have, contributed to that. But as far as the East organization, I know years ago, Nozibele and I, thank you, when you first started working on your dissertation, we started to talk about the 7 degrees of separation with the performers in the East and how we can chart their influence. So we looked at Sun Ra, developing into Earth, Wind, and Fire, developing into who was that? Parliament Funkadelic, developing into X-Clan, because X-Clan definitely was a part of the around that time, in terms of, that the East was flourishing, when the East was at its strongest. So a lot of times when they were talking about to the East, my brother to the East, we talked about how we thought they were talking about the East in terms of geographical location, but they were actually referring to the East organization and its impact that it had. So for me, I think the East is a wonderful organization because they went on deliberate enculturalization, right, of African-American children and people. So, enculturalization is a way that we absorb culture. And a lot of times is things that we are not conscious of. So we are brought up in a household, and, in some cases we are taught to, when we come into a room, to speak to an elder first, right? Or we are taught to defer to elders in a certain way. And those are the things that we grow up with. But we also grow up with being socialized in American schools about how to pledge our allegiance, who we pledge our allegiance to, and what is our relationship to this country that we live in. And the fact that the East deliberately set about to change those things in terms of the schooling. They had like a really complex network that they talked about in the video. Not only did they have schools for children, they had programs for adults, they had a bookstore, they had publishing, they had school. They had a catering business, they had a record shop, they had newspaper. And so they were really, really looking at all the aspects of African American life that they can influence, right? And try to reclaim the mindset to turn it toward more of an African outlook, to reculture and reposition them in terms of not only saying that they're repositioning Africa, but to actually go about trying to make sure they reposition Africa in people's brains, and not just for the members of the organization, but for the community as well. And I think that that's why you can see the lasting legacies of people of, the East, the children, and, carrying all those things on. So I thought that part was very interesting. And the last thing I'm going to say, because I know Estee probably wants to jump in terms of the gender dynamics. We have to be honest and upfront, and not read history through, how do you say it, a presentist lens in Jamila, because that was very much a part of the zeitgeist, the moment of the time, in terms of how women were supposed to be, right? When you go into these Black nationalists or these cultural organizations, they were looking at an example of womanhood, even though they tried to say it was African of origin. The way that they talked about womanhood and discussed womanhood was from a Eurocentric point of view, right? Because if you look at women on the continent, and if you looked at how they behaved, it definitely wasn't the way that they were, they were setting it up in these, not just Black cultural organizations, but any type of organization at the time. There was like, this is how a woman should be, this is how a man should be. You had these clear cut rules of behavior that wasn't necessarily rooted in anything other than Western ideology. So I'll stop there, but I do want us to talk some more about that, because we can look back and say, oh, they can do that, that's so wrong with the gender, but they didn't know. The scholarship, like, we're always learning new things, and the scholarship is always improving. They didn't know that much at the time.
I know you said it. I know you said we got to go to Estee. I'm not trying to dish you, sis, but yes, presentism is a real thing. Howsoever, when we're looking back with these present eyes, howsoever, when we look, just like in this particular film, one of the reasons I appreciate the film, as I said in the beginning, it's a documenting. The other thing I appreciate about the film, let me see what were my exact words in my exact notes, is that the film incorporates the naming and the questioning of sexism and how women and men intimate with the East thought and think about it. There's always a resistance.
Yeah.
There's always a resistance.
I'm not saying they weren't resistant, because they were resistant.
What I'm saying is that we can look back now on the 60s and say, man, that was backwards what y'all did. And it might be, okay, well, you're looking at it from the lens of the 21st century, where we're talking about gender on a spectrum. It was folks back then who knew it wasn't right and said, we're not having this. Mm-hmm. And those people either had to leave formations and organizations, or they stayed and struggled and had the organization grow. So I just wanted to.
I'm not saying that, because there was a definite sister that was out there when she said that they announced that they were going to pair them up with somebody. She was like, oh, it's time for me to go back to college. So there's, I'm not saying that individual people did not resist. I'm talking about organizational perspectives or collective group perspectives. And I think one of the reasons why those perspectives, changed and developed and grew, because you had individuals that said, let's look at this. You know, I know you're putting this forth as an organizational philosophy, as a cultural philosophy, but it's something not right about this. So it's because those people persisted that we were able to say, you know, to basically call BS.
No, my response is just that when we say, well, it's a product of the time, it's wrong.
It can. Don't forget after Estee to come back to me, because I do have something to say about that. And it's not, again, a dichotomy. It's not like good cultural nationalism, bad revolutionary nationalism, or vice versa, good Panthers are bad. I think we're at the point where we can talk more like there are no good guys or bad guys in this story, and parse through a lot of the perspectives because they are very nuanced.
Estee, jump in the conversation.
Yeah, I actually feel like this is my entry point anyway, because this for me it was all new information. I didn't know the East existed. Yeah, total new information. I promise you, I could not locate a girlfriend of mine that knows that the East existed. Like totally separated from the cultural knowledge of my peer group. So I really enjoyed the documentary because it led me down the rabbit hole of of like of course I know the us organization, you know what I'm saying, I know Black Panther, but like the East I had no I didn't know what it was until we were watching it for this. So I think I kind of had a very open-minded just excitement about the documentary in general. And so then in preparation, when I was thinking about talking about it today, I was kind of like, oh, I need to watch it again because I need to go back with the more critical eye. But of course, what stood out to me was gender dynamics, which I was like, this is my doorway. The gender dynamics I thought were interesting. I love the sister who was like, oh, okay, well, this has been wonderful. I'm
time for me to go to college.
That was Fela.
Yeah,
that was Fela Barcliff. Fela Barcliff. Her name was Fela.
Shayla. Yes, Ashe sis. So I love that. Of course, my question is like, where are the gay folks? Where are the folks who
they wouldn't have they would have been underground at that point,
right? But I'm also thinking about location, right? So and it's interesting too because it's Pride Month. It's June 2nd. Pride is June month. June is Pride Month. So New York is a place where, in particular, Black folks had access and freedom around sexuality and gender expression that they weren't really underground in the same ways. So, especially not by this particular time period. So I actually kind of push against that they had to be underground. My question is that were they just absolutely refused? Were they told not to participate? Were they not allowed to be visible? Like I have those kinds of questions. But that was really all that I kind of go ahead. Yeah, I want to hear. That's what
were you saying, that they had to be underground or that they were underground?
I would say they were not like, I mean, so we look, I agree with you, Estee. Like at that time, you definitely have Black queer folks that are, just more present. Like we recognize that they're in the community. I'm taking it from the perspective of even me growing up, and I didn't grow up in the 60s. If someone was queer, it is not a conversation that they're going to have, because a lot of the homophobic rhetoric was very much part of that kind of cultural nationalist, Black nationalist community. And so you weren't going to talk about it. If you were going to talk about it, I had when I was an undergrad, I had a colleague, a peer, who, the conversation was, I mean, he had definitely identified as gay for like 10 years, and then came into nationalist movements and was like, oh, that's some of the white man stuff. I don't do that anymore. So those were the conversations that I experienced. I don't know about y'all, but I think that is more what you would experience. So there may be folks that are queer, but they're going to hide, or they're going to, adopt those kinds of distorted, like, I can be transformed. What do you call that when they the religious
like ex-gay?
No, I can't think.
Exorcism?
The conversation is very very homophobic within those communities that I had experienced growing up.
So when I looked at the primary sources, I did not I could not, the conversation was heteronormative.
Mm-hmm.
But I didn't see any anti-LGBTQ rhetoric. Nothing that I would, as a heterosexual woman who grew up in a heteronormative environment, and who doesn't like, queer studies is not my area. So what I could possibly pick up, I didn't pick up anything that was anti-LGBTQ. Now, again, for full disclosure, Nozibele and I actually have a working relationship with Martha Bright, who was interviewed on the documentary. And I think we asked her about that, and she said everybody was welcome. And I think from personal experience, this is not from my studies, that's not, I wouldn't say that's welcoming to the LGBTQ community. It's just, well, everybody's welcome, but we don't say one thing or another about it. We don't take a position.
Mm-hmm.
And I think for allies, for people to be comfortable, there has to be something more overt about how LGBTQ people, members of the LGBTQ plus community are welcome. LGBTQ. So I did question that when I looked at the group of Kawaida organizations as a whole, and women in these groups. And I'll tell you, Amina Baraka, wife of Amiri Baraka, over time took a very strong stance on being open and supportive of members of the LGBTQ community, to the point where the last time I did some like, I googled her, there's I think an oral history. She has an oral history on like an LGBTQ organization's page, and that's because that's a part of their personal family story. Amiri Baraka and Amina Baraka's daughter Shani was queer and was the victim of horrible sexist and anti-LGBTQ violence. She was killed. And so then this is after, though, they were this is far, decades after they were into cultural, overtly into cultural nationalism. So that's a question, so it doesn't refute what you said, Ido Ifetayo. It doesn't refute what you said, that within the rubric of when you're overtly so-called cultural nationalists, where is the space made for LGBTQ community members? And like, yeah, this wasn't the era. 65 to like 75 or 86, because or 69 to 86 is when the East existed. And because it was so many offshoots, 86 is when the Uhuru Sasa Shule closed. A lot of the other institutions folded earlier than that. But yeah, the 69 to 86 window, or 69 to 75, when you're talking about overt cultural nationalism, yeah, it wasn't, none of the rhetoric was very overtly open to LGBTQ community members.
And I think we have to be honest about it. One of the things I did love about, jumping back a bit, about Martha Bright, she was saying that they were open to everyone, and it was kind of like a low pressure, low stakes organization as long as you did your work and as long as you pulled your share, because she said she never felt the need to change her name to an African name. And she never felt harassment from other people to do so. She was like, I like my name. I'm going to be Martha Bright. You can call me Mama Martha, whatever. I'm not going to change and get an African name. So they were open and welcoming in that respect. But we have to be honest about what people were saying in terms of nation building at the time, right? Because nation building at the time was husband, wife, raising Black children for the nation. That's what it was. A woman's position was to birth them babies, raise them up, to be strong Black people, to go against the man. The man is the protector or whatever he does. So it was very heteronormative in the language and very heteronormative in the ways that they thought that they can liberate African people, starting with the family as a basis. And I think that's why you don't hear a lot about that. To be honest, they were excluded without saying that they were being excluded.
But they weren't overtly included.
Yeah, they weren't. They weren't either way. You know what I'm saying? And unfortunately, that's the reality of what was happening.
And I want to just clarify, when you say go against the man, you mean the system of white Eurocentric,
the white
man, right? Because you then said and then to do something with the man, and the man.
Yeah, let's clarify.
That's one
but
thing.
As a feminist, maybe I'm talking about all men, or am I a woman?
No,
about
right,
some men?
right. That's
you
what
never know with me. You never know with me.
Yeah,
they was talking about the white man, sister.
Right, and so the Black man was the head of the household. And I want to clarify, you said then their perception of nation building rested on the family as a cornerstone of nation, which is that's a great point. But it wasn't always a woman and a man and wife. That was one of the points of contingency that we're talking about. It was often a man and wives.
Yes.
And so, they did.
Didn't they say they have one incident in the East where one woman had two husbands? I thought they said it was one incident.
I don't remember them saying that because they were.
That wasn't in the film.
Yeah, I was trying to listen for it, and I didn't know if I missed it, because when they were talking about something being African, I'm like, okay, so y'all are not really talking about polygynous societies. You just are interested in polygamous societies that is just a man that has multiple wives. I do want to pull in
the opposite of what you said.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
Yeah.
One man that has multiple wives. Yes, but they weren't interested in women having multiple husbands. I want to pull in a comment. Shinzira said, after spending 30 years in a nationalistic group, it's don't ask, don't tell, as opposed when we're talking about our family members in the LGBTQ plus community. She said it was no abuse of queer people was allowed, but it was ignored, and as it wasn't a distraction. What she's saying actually reminds me of how my family dealt with it, because there was definitely one person in our family who always at Thanksgiving, Kim had Angie, and they were always there. Kim and Angie lived together. I remember trying to wrap my head around, okay, so Kim and Angie live together and they're in the same bedroom, and didn't nobody ever talk about nothing. And so then I was like maybe 19, I had a big mouth, and I was like, so they're gay, right? They this is a couple, right? And everything was cool as long as you didn't say that. So Angie could come and participate and, be part of the family, but you just couldn't say they were gay.
They were very close friends.
They were roommates.
Living in the same house.
Roommates who slept in the same bed. Yeah.
In the same bed.
One bedroom.
For economical
reasons. Bedroom, one bed.
For economical reasons. Rent high in LA, girl. They had to share that bed.
Kim and Angie. And I was the big mouth that was like, wait a minute here. Is this what's really happening? And so then, of course, it got ignored.
And I think that's so funny because about African American families. At some point, we're going to get back to the East. I think it's the way that you're raised to behave. And one of the beautiful things that I remember one of the interviewees saying about the East is that they felt protected. That when a carnival came, you know, they were just gone. And people would be like, oh, I see you here and I see you there. And I know at one point in the community that that was something that I always wanted for, my children, right? To be able to go from place to place and be protected and be safe. And I think that the fact that they accomplished that, a safe space for children, so that most of the children look back on the East with fond memories. All the people who were interviewed, I don't remember anybody saying, oh my God, I hated that, I did this or whatever. Everybody
That
looked
don't
back
mean
on
that
it
they may have
with
not
fond.
interviewed the people that had the negative memories.
Well, it's always going to be somebody with negative memories because I mean, how many Uhuru Sasas do we have as African people in names of schools? You know, um, yeah. So
I mean, when I heard that part, I was kind of, and Jamila, I'm going to give you the last word before you have to go because I know you have a hard stop at 1 o'clock. I remember thinking about how I thought 20 years ago versus how I thought now. So when she was saying, like, basically everybody was your mama, you could move and flow and you didn't have to worry about anything. It reminds me, Estee, when we were talking and how you talk about growing up in rural Georgia and having a similar experience. And I think I'm tainted and I'm getting old. So I'm like, yeah, but somebody was doing something wrong. I'm just tainted now. And so I was like, well, that's nice that everybody, on the documentary says it is wonderful, but who did they not interview? But that's just me.
No, that's a good question. That's a good question. I mean, I can tell you from my perspective, who they didn't interview.
Oh.
So they did not interview women who, okay, so I talked to Nozibele about this. This was a great documentary. I liked it. Really good for basic information. And the filmmakers, I wrote their names down. Giwa,
Tayo.
Tayo Giwa and Cynthia Gordy Giwa. And they are clear that their perspective is about Black owned businesses in Brooklyn. And I think if I understand the way they put together the documentary, they got initially interested because there were so many Brooklyn based businesses that the East sponsored or ran, uh, spearheaded. So that is a wonderful part of the East's legacy. Nozibele mentioned some, but each one has its own story that can be told, right?
Absolutely.
So
I got the list,
yeah,
by the way.
there's like Kununuana, the health food co-op, right? So a man named Joshua Davis has writes about them in terms of being a part of a larger cooperative movement and being pioneers in bringing health foods to a community,
Mm.
to Brooklyn. And I write about that too, because often it was the women who coordinated things like getting the produce from outside of Brooklyn, which was really what they call I called a food desert in the dissertation, but it's, now they're saying it's food apartheid, right? And they were
Mm.
helping to overcome that, and the logistics and stuff were often developed by women. And so I'm interested in that, and the way that it is also speaks to a larger idea about women's place in propagating Afrocentric, African-centered, Black cultural nationalist foodways, right?
Mm.
From to the point where I don't eat beef and pork to this day. You know what I'm saying? I went through my vegetarian phase, and it wasn't because of, or vegan, right? And it wasn't because of you know I've written a newsletter article on, it wasn't through this idea of middle class white people's veganism. It was, this is a part of what we need to do for our nation to keep our bodies strong and healthy, that kind of thing, right? And so the East and its Kanunuana and its Sweet East Bakery, and the way they talked about what you could get when you went to the club, right? They offered edutainment, they said, as they called it, in the club. But you got healthy food like kawaii rice. I don't know if you noticed that they didn't even make a big deal out of it. They're like, this is the kawaii rice. And so, and it's interesting because they didn't say what kawaii was or anything like that. Maybe because they would have to answer questions like the ones that Ifetayo asked at the beginning and get off topic. Yeah, and they were like, we had the East Punch, and they had a whole bunch of recipes. Like Martha Bright, when I interviewed her, was like, here's the recipe for our this and our that, and that's spun off more businesses that weren't East businesses, and many of those were woman run. And then but what it doesn't do, right, it is place the East in this larger conversation about kawaii influenced organizations and about the reality of Black nationalism at the time. We're talking cultural nationalism and revolutionary nationalism as it is two different things. But if anybody out there tuned in and watched Bigger Than Africa, they heard a conversation about how the Oba, Adefumi the First, would, call on the Black Panther Party and they would come. And I assume they were talking about New York Panthers, back to Thandisizwe, right? And so I don't want to leave us thinking that this is a real, this is a real concrete thing, this cultural versus revolutionary nationalism. Also, I hope y'all get to talk more about the edutainment. Nozibele brought up how the X-Clan actually played at the East and were referring to the East in some of their raps. And Pharaoh Sanders, if you look at them, his records even, some of them were live from the East. If you look at the jazz, especially experimental jazz at the time, a lot of it was live from the East. And Kawaida inflected. Did y'all know there was a Kawaida album?
Before you go, as we saw in the film, there was not a flyer, photograph James Mtume playing
Yes,
congas at the
I was gonna
East.
say that.
And whenever people talk about Mtume, Mtume, Juicy Fruit Mtume.
Of Biggie's Juicy.
Oh yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, you got to talk about Tume. I know we were stuck on days talking about days.
Came through the US organization, left and went to the East Coast. Went to the East. So
and that's where his name came from. Kawaida affiliation. Phyllis Hyman played at the East before she was, so it was a big and there a man actually wrote a book about his time at the East as he came through Uhuru Sasa Shule, because he was seen as a problem child in the public school system, and how it just changed his life, and he became a behind the scenes entertainer. Another person who came out of the East is Ola Mashariki. If you look at, she's head of Audible Studios now, but if you look at a lot of cultural films that were greenlighted by big studios, you will see her name and her imprint. So the East has had a long imprint, and put their stamp on a lot. And there's an hour is not enough time, but I appreciate you all. I have to go to another meeting.
All right, thank you. This time we have more to talk about in terms of this topic. So we'll see you next time, Nozibele. Yeah, that it really makes me think, because I was so surprised. The only reason I knew anything about the East and their school is because of Nozibele. And there's a book, I think it's The View from the East. I'll get the book and post it in the chat. And that's something that I had heard about them. But then when I'm looking at this documentary, and I'm like, they had all of this stuff, they were doing all this stuff, and lots of people don't know about it. And so then that took me to, of course, I wasn't surprised when you got COINTELPRO and the active efforts to disrupt the work that they were doing. And even today, as they talk at the end of the documentary about gentrification and its impact on Black-owned businesses in Brooklyn, I think it's important for us to just kind of recognize that this is something that's huge, and the effort to kind of cut down all of this work that has been done over these decades is still continuing even today. It just looks different.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think the thing about the East that is like one of the things that we should be careful about when we're talking about it. We may not have known about it, but definitely people in New York are familiar with it, because I asked Waithe's mom, I was like, "Oh, have you heard of the East?" And she's from the Bronx. They live in the Bronx. And when we talked about, she was like, "The East," I was like, "Oh, oh yeah, I heard about that," and that was a thing. So it was one of the things. And going back to COINTELPRO and those types of things, I think they were very successful in repressing it so that it remained kind of kishy, and that it's like something that's really localized, that only if you're in that area you would know about, because if it were to spread outward, I think the East could have did some real damage if it moved beyond the Brooklyn area.
I wanted to go through real quick what was listed in the film. So you have the East, which was the institution, and the institution and the building. They had Uhuru Sasa Shule, which was the school. They had the East Jazz Club, which was the venue, Sweet East Restaurant, East Kitchen and Caterers, Black News Newspaper, East Publishers, East Records, Imani Child Development Center, Akiba Mku Bookstore, Mawasi Clothing Co-op, the Evening School of Knowledge, the Kunu Nuana Food Cooperative, a radio show on BAI called Education at the Crossroads. They created the African Street Festival, which is now known as the International African Arts Festival. That's been going for over 50 years. And when I would hear about the East, I hadn't heard about any of this. I had heard of something that was never mentioned in the film, the Slave Theater in Brooklyn and G2AUC. And so I'm wondering, y'all was doing plays, you had playwrights, and it makes sense if you're talking about culture, right? But I didn't hear about the slave theater being mentioned. So I don't know if that's something that they spearheaded, but it's definitely something that they were associated with. The other thing I wanted to mention, and arthritis is not knocking on the door, so I can go a little bit longer today, y'all. Two things I wanted to mention real quick. Usually the issue of polygamy and gender roles is a wedge in an organization. And this is just based on the film. This is not based on an extensive study, but just based on the film. What are some of the things that led to the demise of the East? Burnout, which is, to be understood. You got folks who are about the real work, but it usually falls on a few people as opposed to many people. Grown-ups with grown-up responsibilities. The movement did not necessarily sustain those individuals financially, that movement of the East, and it did not necessarily sustain itself financially, which took a toll. And of course, surveillance and counterintelligence. So all of these things took a toll. All of these things are the kind of things that took a toll on the demise of this organization. But just like with this film and the people that interviewed, its legacy continues and will continue to continue. And I'm gonna let somebody else speak, but there was one more point I wanted to get at, but I'll wait. I'll defer.
I was reading a book on how social movements die by Christian Davenport, and they're talking about the demise of the RNA. And one of the things they talked about internal and external pressures.
RNA,
I'm sorry, Republic of New Africa.
Well, that's interesting because it's people right around today who will tell you, what you mean demise? We still here.
Yeah, are just like the fractures that occurred within RNA, right? Republic of New Africa. But one of the things that they said that they targeted, because they had a detailed list of the ways that the state would repress social movement organizations. And they said as soon as they saw a bookstore opening, then they moved up on the threat level, because they had different threat levels. And, they'll be like, okay, we're going to watch this organization and see what happens. We're not even going to, deploy any type of, informants. We're just going to see, right? And then when it starts to get up, but as soon as they started to open up a bookstore and doing some of those things, the threat level increases. And so the repressive techniques increases as well. So I can imagine all of these things that are going on with the East, and some of those repressive techniques does include starving people off financially, right? Because I know one of the guy who was raised up in the East, he was very candid. He was like, okay, I can't do what I did when I was 20, because I have a family to take care of. I have real responsibilities. I don't have time like that. So they needed to get more membership, right? And I think they also mentioned that in the documentary, that they were having trouble getting younger people in. So that's when social movement organizations start to face a real challenge. And we can see that happening with the East, as per some of the things they mentioned in the documentary.
I wanted to make a couple of comments. I wanted to point out Dawn. I don't know, Dawn is here in the States right now, but she's from Guyana. So she was saying it's a good conversation, and she was wondering what role that Black immigrants. So she's talking about people from the Caribbean, where she's from, and our brothers and sisters maybe from the continent, what role that they played. I'm absolutely sure that some of those Africans had to be from the Caribbean that were members of the East. They didn't talk about it specifically.
Well, no, they did. Well, no, they didn't go into detail, but they talked about
them going to Guyana. So Don,
Adeyemi Bandele, they said that he was Jamaican, so his roots are Jamaican. One of the founders of the East, and another brother whose name I forget, but they mentioned the fact that this was another brother whose roots or was actually from another country, but I can't remember what it was. But this is all in the days, what we call the heyday, before this confusion with that alphabet group came about. It makes people think that African immigrants and Black people in the U.S. do not interact, and that it's all just we hate one another. Not that we intermarry and understand that it's one struggle. Don't get me started on these people. I was in a good mood.
Okay, so let's focus. Let's focus. Nozibele. So Fred Ogbemi wants to know the name of the book that you just said. Say it out loud again so I can find it.
Okay, the name of the book is How Social Movements Die, Repression and Demobilization of the Republic of New Africa.
Yeah, I need to get that book.
Christian
I never heard of that. Is that a Christian with a K or a CH?
With a C. It's a C. He's from the part of Africa that has C's.
No, there was another book by another Christian. I was wondering if it's the same author, but okay.
Oh, no.
Okay. No. And then the other thing is that they did talk, and they didn't say what happened, but at the time, this goes back to Don's question, they were specifically talking about in the documentary how, I guess this was in the 1970s. I don't know if it was the 1960s or the 1970s. The president of Guyana had given 300 acres of land to the East, like they did to that other fool in California that went and took all those Africans and murdered them. And so they went down there and they were cultivating the land, but they actually didn't follow up and say what happened. I'm assuming because they're back here, they didn't do anything.
That's a fact. I don't know the specifics with the East, but what I have begun to find out is the Guyana connection to me is just fascinating in terms of Black nationalist history here in the United States. Guyana is the country in South America. This is in the 60s, late 60s, early 70s. This is the time period where Dr. Walter Rodney, who was Guyanese, went off to college, went to Tanzania to teach. Tanzania, this bastion of nationalism, self-determination, socialism, Ujamaa. He comes back. He's teaching in the University of the West Indies in Jamaica and gets banned and put out of Jamaica. He returns home to Guyana. This international figure who is now back home in Guyana, and he's not just what you call an ivory tower scholar. He's a part of an organization working with the masses of the people, ends up getting assassinated in 1980. But this is during the time period where there's heavy Pan-African political activity. And just like Nzimile gave her props to Akinyele, Professor Umoja, I got to give props too, because it was he who explained to me that a sister right there in Atlanta, Georgia, Mama Chaiko Kwayana, you probably know about Baba Ross Kofi, his mother, I did not know this at the time. At the time, she was one of the ones, she's married to UC Kwayana, compatriot of Dr. Walter Rodney. She was one of the ones who was, if not the one, who was explaining to Black nationalist communities here in the U.S., Guyana is a place that you can come to, especially if you need assistance. And I was wondering how that happened, because Herman Ferguson, a member of the Republic of New Africa, vice president of the Republic of New Africa, was facing frame-up charges of attempting to assassinate Black leaders in the late 60s, just like the Panther 21. Herman Ferguson fled to Guyana. Two members of the US organization. That story remains to be told and will be told at some point. The two members of the US organization who were convicted of conspiracy in the murder of John and Munchie. Not that they committed it, because that was a whole different thing. They escaped from prison and went where? To Guyana initially. So
And
the whole Guyanese connection is fascinating.
And like I said, Donna is from there, and so lives in Guyana, and so she maybe one time we can get her to come on and talk to us, because she can kind of give us some history in their background. Now the government that they're there now, don't be trying to do nothing and think you're gonna escape there, because that's not, it ain't going on right now. No.
Did you really say that? Did you really say that?
You know, it ain't. I'm just trying to help family members out.
Trying to help us out.
Yeah.
Come on, Estee. Come on.
Got to speak the truth.
We didn't mean to leave you behind. It's just so much.
No. I'm enjoying
about organizations, not even just organizations.
You breaking up?
Say it again, Nozibele.
Nozibele?
Okay. I think the thing about organizations and about people, that there was a lot of social mixing, right? So you had people that were in core and a part of the East, people who were in the RNA, who was also a part of, different organizations back then. And I think it's really interesting, because when they talked about how the school and how the East developed out of this Ocean Hill, Brownsville conflict with the teachers and the schools, and how different Black organizations went to New York to start. They didn't necessarily talk about it as the RNA drove to New York.
You breaking
up real bad.
Yeah, you're breaking up real bad. We can't follow along. Uh-oh.
I'm gonna take her out. No, but I'm gonna take you out and put you back in, because you're breaking up real bad.
She might need to come out and sign back in. So Estee, I'm sorry, we just hogged the conversation all away from you.
No, it was good, because I'm a student today. No, it was good. I think just closing statements. One of the things that I really, really loved that I saw was just how they dealt with children. And I think Nzimile was kind of speaking to this around the edutainment piece, because I think it happened with young adults too, and just kind of their approach to, which I think is true about Black organizations in general. But I've seen some organizations do some interesting things when it came to kids. And
we'll leave it like that.
And I'm gonna leave it there. But I didn't have that experience in watching this and witnessing this, and in what I subsequently read. So I love things like the reference to like we were the original Wakanda. You know, they got pictures
that was cute.
doing this. You know, to all of the the references to the music, and I just love that part. But one statement that just I remember really standing out to me, that one of the ladies said that she was taught while being a child in the East was that she was like, you know, we were taught that to waste our gift was to disrespect our ancestors. And so that for me was more poignant than just that one statement. It was clear to me that there was a permanency of how they were building relationships with each other as a community, as an institution, and, you know, with their own connections with ancestors in the continent. So I really, if there's a takeaway, I wanted to offer that to the conversation.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I wanted to kind of offer a couple of things. I know Sister Tandy had her notes, and thank you for noting down all those businesses, because as I was listening, I was like, this is a lot. I felt pride. I ain't did nothing. You know, I ain't put no kind of costume, didn't do no kind of work over there, but I was all proud. Like, look at what we did.
I thought the same thing too. I was like, oh, and they had caterers. They had I was like, oh, we did that too.
But I used a different pronoun. You said they. I'm talking about we.
We did that.
Like I was there and did something.
Me way out here in LA. Yeah, we did that. Yeah. Oh, you know, the other thing too is that, and if you saw in the film, right, when they were talking about Ocean Hill, Brownsville, and the East, they had that map of Brooklyn in, you know, talking about the fact that Brooklyn is the most or at that time was the most concentrated area of Black people outside of the continent. And they had the map of Brooklyn in red, black, and green. I was telling a sister friend of mine the other day in Brooklyn after watching this, okay, I understand how y'all are the way that y'all are now. I get it now. Because at first I had no idea what y'all were talking about. I get it now. It was some show that was on back in the day, and I want to say it was Def Comedy Jam. I don't think it was Def Comedy Jam, but it was some kind of show. And when the announcer would talk about it, he said, from the Republic of Brooklyn. And I was like, what is this Negro talking about? And then eventually it morphed into from the planet of Brooklyn. I was like, oh, y'all your own world now. Okay.
Now you see why.
I have no understanding. I'm clear now. I am very clear. Ashe.
I mean, I was feeling like I wish I could have been raised or had my kid. Like, yeah, it made me feel excited. The couple of things to kind of draw on, and then Nozibele, I'll let you close out with your comments. The things that stood out to me, definitely the edutainment. I love that piece. I, of course, as a psychologist, I was paying attention to the burnout, because with that whole list of businesses that you said, Thandi, I was like, wow. And we know the sisters was in there doing the work. We know who was, you know, in the kitchen and stuff like that, and really organizing and stuff. And so I was thinking about burnout. I was thinking about the psychological impact of burnout and the impact on families and the overall community, and then the longevity of the businesses. I do think I would love for us to have a conversation one day to think about like business structure, because if we look at whether it be the East, whether it be the Nation of Islam, we can go through a whole list. Us organization, Black Panther Party, we can look at different organizations, that Black organizations at that time, when we think about kind of like from the 1960s to the mid 1970s, where they had these businesses, but the businesses ultimately fold. And particularly if we go into the late 70s to early 80s, you see lots of schools, lots of Black businesses closing. And I think about, there's this model where they're opening these businesses based on capitalist functioning, but then have socialist ideas. And I'm like, so how do those things line up? Can they line up? And then in terms of succession planning, in terms of just being able to sustain a business over multiple generations, being able to appropriately pay the people that work in your business so they can sustain their families. Because if you talk about what y'all were saying earlier, Nozibele and Jamila talking about nation building and family. So if you got this heterosexual model, man, woman, and you build a family and create this Black nation, well, how they gonna do that if you can't feed the family? And that flows into Black businesses being able to sustain them, over time, being able to pass them down in generations, bringing new talent in and developing that talent. I think we don't have enough conversations about that. And perhaps because I'm a business owner, I think about these things, because it's nice when you got a bunch of 19-year-olds that can volunteer because they're on their parents' dime. But what happens when you really need to have people that have a little more experience, or when you need people to stay long term and they need health insurance, and they need to pay their light bills and feed their family? And I don't think we have enough conversations around that. So I would like to challenge us to maybe in the future have a conversation about that, because I think there was a lot here, even in this film, for us to kind of pull apart. And that being said, I'm going to leave that as my last comment. Nozibele, I wanted you to go back to your comment because we couldn't hear all of what you were saying.
Oh, and I don't even remember what I was saying, but I think that this pretty much ties into our next session about Black genius, right? Because if you look at everything that not only the East did, but African people in general, how we had to, pull two straws together to make a house, right? How we had to be very innovative and very resourceful. And I think because a lot of times that the businesses that we start, the schools that we
See,
I don't know what happened.
The white man, that's what it is. The white man.
It's the system.
The white man.
She's trying to get us some truth today.
Okay, so let me tell you something. The white man done created this platform for you to be on.
Exactly. And now he messing it up.
Anyway,
from communicating with our people.
What are your closing comments? I mean, and Tanya, you have seen a lot of this. You have seen a lot of the burnout that happens within the community.
Mm-hmm.
The people leaving in droves. I think Chinzira said that. There's a lot of this discussion now in nationalist groups because there is a model, which is really interesting because when I think about it, it kind of comes from enslavement, that Black people should work for free in organizations.
Another discussion for another day, sis. Another discussion for it's so much. It's never a shortage of material. Never. I don't care what it is. There's never a shortage of material. But the one thing I wanted to say about this film, it was obvious to me that it was done with love.
Yes.
And I wholeheartedly suggest for people who are watching this, if you have not seen it, you need to see it. It's only $4.99 to rent. I think it's $17.99 to purchase digitally. I went on and bought it because this was an independent film that they put together, the couple put together in finance, and then shopped it around to see who will give us a little bit of money for this so that we can put it to a larger audience. So I don't know if they're getting a residual, but I went on and bought it. It's obvious it was done with love. It was a much needed addition to the documenting that needs to occur. There is a book, and you put it in the chat, A View from the East. But there's the intrinsic value of books. There's the intrinsic value of films. I'm not gonna, prioritize one over the other. They're both tools that we need to utilize. So, of course, please get the book, get the video, watch the video. It was done with love. That's obvious, and it's needed. It's necessary.
Chinzira was asking where, what channel is actually on Amazon Prime, so you can rent it from Amazon Prime. You can either rent it and or you can buy it. And Thandi, I like your idea of just going ahead and buying it. I rented it. I did the $3.99 because I don't have an HD TV thing. But that's a way of being able to help support them in terms of the work, because it is a good.
Hopefully, it will.
It's definitely good, and I think it's worth seeing. So, you know, I know folks out here buying a Starbucks and all that other kind of stuff. So by the time you buy 2 of those, you could support this film.
You can support this independent film on this.
Yeah.
It's a platform that we don't own, but it is our film.
And you can actually go to their website. So if you just what is it called?
Black owned Brooklyn.
If you go directly to the website, you can get the film from there also. So, last comment, Estee, as we get ready to close.
Yeah, I think I didn't buy it, but I do think also having, like, you know, what we call in the feminist womanist community consciousness raising groups and conversations around the film. I think it's a great one to watch in community. And to just have some conversations. Because the other thing, and Nozibele mentioned this, is I saw so many references to other things that I have seen or heard that I didn't know the origin of. So I think being able to kind of connect those threads with that are already in our culture, in our circles, in our vernacular, and being able to understand what was really going on. Because I think they did a really good job of really giving us the backstory of how we got here, what community control was about, you know, like how things were slandered, how the whole anti-Semitism bullshit, right? Like how all these things really led up to the conspiracy with the teachers, like how all these components really led up to Black folks organizing and building institutions in the ways that we did. I think it helps us to understand. It can also give us some blueprint for moving forward, because we know also why these things have not worked. So I really think, you know, watch it. It's not long. I think it's maybe an hour. Yeah, it's not long. Watch it in community, talk about it, and create opportunities for us to be able to learn from these some now ancestors and these elders.
Yeah. So the documentary is called The Sun Rises and the Eats. Is about 58 minutes. I thought it was wonderful also. So I want to definitely encourage everyone to support this documentary and the work that they are doing. And I do agree with you, Estee, that there's some things that they are talking about, the ways that they targeted the school systems and community control in schools that we're seeing, you know, because racists always go by the same playbook. So some of the same stuff that is happening now is the things that they did then. And you know, in terms of just being scared that Black people had control over their schools and their child's education, and, you know, making racist comments, false comments about bringing up anti-Semitism when Jewish people and Black people were working together and trying to.
You know, the thing about what the film did not do, I thought was a good job. Albert Shanker, who was the president of the United Federation of Teachers at that time, he was Jewish. And everything, whenever I read about that era, people are always pointing to him as being a racist dog. So I think that the charges of anti-Semitism may have been coming from comments against him, and they were taken to mean all Jewish people.
Yeah, I mean, I thought it was interesting where they were like, people weren't saying that. It was Black people and Jewish people working together. And
I think some of the teachers were Jewish too. I think that was.
Yeah, no, they talked about the fact that it wasn't Semitism, but I don't think they did a good job of saying the reason why it was said to be anti-Semitism is because we don't like this dude. It's not that we don't like Jewish people. This guy is the problem, Albert Shanker.
But see, so I hear what you're saying. I guess the thing that I took away from it, and I don't know, I wasn't there, is I was taking away that they were saying that wasn't even part of the discussion. That was something that was being made up. Nobody was talking, no one was engaged in anti-Semitism.
No, that's what I'm saying, is that they weren't engaged in anti-Semitism, but the charge is able to get put out there because Albert Shanker is Jewish. So if you're criticizing this head of the teachers union, or if you're criticizing this head of the teachers union and he's a racist dog and you calling him on his racism, the racist dog is able to say, see, they don't like the Jews. No, we just don't like you. We just don't like your ass. Basically, that's what I think it was. We'd have to ask them.
None of us were there. None of us were there
when this happened. But like I said, all of the histories I've read talk about this problematic presence of Albert Shanker.
But well, and I promise this is the last thing. We didn't even get to the school, the teachers union, and how they were in the schools and not even teaching the Black children, and
not even teaching,
had suspended, education.
The students,
yeah, he said they was drinking coffee and going to make their bets.
Going gambling.
But at least the students wasn't like, hey, we got a free day too. The students like, well, we want to learn.
Yeah.
I should.
Yeah.
Okay, Corrie missed us today. She said it was a great discussion. She'll try to watch it, get caught up. Hey, Corrie. So she'll be here the next time. So thank you, everyone that is watching. Please, as always, I always ask you to like and share. It helps with our little algorithm and get us out there a little bit more. So, and then even making comments. So all of that makes a big difference. I'm Dr. Ifetayo Ojelade. I'm a licensed psychologist and the convener of this gathering that we are going to try to figure out a name for.
The gathering with no name.
Gathering with no name in our digital hush harbor. Reverend Estee Nena Dillard, who's also Okunsade. She is an Olokun priestess. She is a queer sexologist, and she's just an all-around wonderful sister. And so thank you, Reverend Estee, for coming.
Of course.
And then out there on our left coast is my sister Thandisizwe Chimurenga, who is an author and a journalist and a social commentator. And so we will see you next month. The first Friday in July, we're going to be talking about Black genius. And so we're going to continue this conversation in a different way to talk about Black genius. So see you next month. Take care.
Peace.